Great. So I know people are kind of slowly making their way in, but because we have not that much time with our panelists today, we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, thank you for joining the panel discussion about the legacy of the Vietnamese Fishermen's Association versus KKK case from the 1980s. I'm Anju Manwala. I am the Vice President of Community Affairs for the Asian Pacific American Bar Association of DC. I'm joined by my colleague on the APABA DC board, Melissa Nanaka. We will both be moderating the panel discussion today. First, just some administrative stuff to get out of the way before we get started. We will be recording this panel discussion and we'll post it on the APABA DC's YouTube website. We will also take questions at the end of the panel discussion. Please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We are very privileged to have 4 distinguished panelists joining us today to discuss this very important case in American history and especially Asian American history. Joining us are 4 panelists. The first is Dr. Thao Ha, who is a Vietnamese refugee and a professor of sociology at Miracosta College in California. She has published works in the areas of race, immigration, and Vietnamese American experience in the South. She is an advisor and associate producer of Sea Drift, a 2019 documentary about the racial violence and KKK intimidation against Vietnamese Americans in Sea Drift, Texas. We also have Joe Levin, who is a co-founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center, or SPLC, where he has served in various capacities since 1971 until 2016 when he retired. He served as legal director and general counsel, among many other roles at the center. He has litigated landmark civil rights cases such as the private segregated school case of Gilmore versus City of Montgomery, and has also previously served in various roles in the federal government. We are also fortunate to have Helen Zia, who is an activist, author, and former journalist. She was the executive editor of Miss Magazine and published her first book in 2000 entitled Asian American Dreams: The Emergence of an American People. She was also featured in the Academy Award nominated documentary Who Killed Vincent Chin. And then last but certainly not least, we have Jenny Kim, who is the Vice President of Policy and Programs at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, or AAJC. Prior to joining AAJC, she worked as a litigator in private practice and previously served as the policy director of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, or NAPABA. Of course, all of these individuals have done many other things and are extremely accomplished. So those just name a few of the many things that they have done. So kind of moving on, the reason APABA DC wanted to present this case, it was supposed to be a reenactment case this year. However, with COVID, we weren't able to put on the reenactment as we would have done normally. With the significant rise in hate crimes against the Asian American community in the US, particularly over the last year, with the use of terms like Kung Flu and China virus, we thought that unfortunately this case was particularly relevant still, even though it happened about 40 years ago. Before we get into the discussion with the panelists, we just wanted to provide you with a brief overview of what the case was actually about. Many of us are not aware of this important victory against the KKK that happened in 1982. During and after the Vietnam War, many Vietnamese refugees immigrated to the United States, and some settled in the Galveston Bay Area of Texas to work in the fishing industry there. The competition with the local white fishermen was fierce, and the white fishermen there tried very hard to lobby to prevent the Vietnamese fishermen from being able to engage in this important economic activity. The competition came to a head in 1979, and a white crabber was fatally shot, and 2 Vietnamese individuals were tried for murder and acquitted on self-defense grounds. This triggered the white community to mistrust the Vietnamese community even more in the area, and then February 1981, white fishermen organized a rally against the Vietnamese fishermen with Louis Beam, the head of the Texas KKK, and other members of the KKK's military arm, which is called the Texas Emergency Reserve. The KKK, with the white fishermen, engaged in intimidation and hateful tactics against the Vietnamese community by burning boats, for example, parading around the Bay Area in a threatening manner, and then also by practicing or trying to learn guerrilla tactics at secret military camps in the area. Ultimately, the SPLC filed a lawsuit on behalf of the Vietnamese Fishermen's Association against the KKK to prevent and stop its campaign of violence by arguing, among many other legal challenges, that they had violated the federal civil rights of the Vietnamese community through federal statutes, the violation of the 13th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution, various tort and contract common law claims, and uniquely also bringing claims under the Sherman Antitrust Act and a very little known at the time Texas law that prohibited the operation of private armies. Fortunately, in 1982, the federal district court in Texas issued a permanent injunction that prohibited the KKK from threatening or harassing the Vietnamese community or inciting, importantly, others to do so. So now, with all of this background, I want to turn it over to Thao, who, given your ties to the Vietnamese community, and particularly the Vietnamese refugee community in Texas, can you provide us with some more information about kind of what the community was going through at the time?
Yeah, thank you for that excellent summary. I want to share a little bit, some visuals to what you had just discussed, and some backdrop, some stories to kind of fill in the context right before the case. I grew up in Texas, very close to the areas that we're talking about. I'm going to share the screen now to a PowerPoint slide presentation and walk us through some of the details. So let me get that up and running. Can you all see that? So the Seadrift story started in a book which I had written a chapter about the Vietnamese in Texas. And this was published in a book called Asian Texans, and then that's where the film was made. In the research, I had looked at the history of Vietnamese immigration to the surrounding area of Houston, which is my hometown, and the larger state of Texas, and particularly was interested in the coastal towns because of the dominant fishing industry that Vietnamese had participated in. And so in 1980, roughly 230,000 Vietnamese refugees had come to the US. In 75, a large influx of 120,000, and many of those immigrants ended up in the small coastal towns along Texas, in the larger cities, making Texas the third largest destination for Vietnamese immigrants outside of Vietnam, behind the two large communities in California, Orange County and San Jose. And so Houston had a large wave of Vietnamese immigrants, and so part of that was then to have some of those immigrants come to small towns like Seadrift. So in 1979, the population of Seadrift was roughly 1,300, about 90% white. The remaining non-white individuals were majority Latino, Latinx population. And so today it's still about the same, very small town. And Vietnamese fishermen, shrimpers, and crabbermen were recruited to Seadrift by a crab plant owner named Jan Ruthenberg. He had owned a crab processing plant in Maryland and came to open one there and recruited Vietnamese workers at the call of governments to employ the refugees. And so he had a handful of women come work at the crab plants, and and then their members. And so by the end of 1989, there were over 100 Vietnamese who had come. And that was an adjustment for the community, a disruption in their economy, and with the larger context of post-war phobia that was going on at the time as well, fears of the communists coming, and kinds of rhetoric that was kind of the larger context of what people were feeling. And so Seadrift is about 3 hours south of Houston, and so Seadrift was not the only place where the tensions between local fishermen and Vietnamese fishermen, it was not the only town where that was happening. So Port Lavaca, Rockport, Aransas Pass, Palacios, all of those towns had Vietnamese Americans coming to work in the industry, and there were tensions all along the Gulf Coast. Drift happens to just be the location where this incident happened. And so the tensions led to the situation that Anjum had described earlier, where a white crabberman named Joe Allen had harassed Vietnamese fishermen for several years. The tensions had mounted for about 3 years before the violent incident between two brothers, Chin and Sao Nguyen, with Billy Joe Applin. And it happened on the docks. And so this is a picture of the brothers going to trial. In the end, as Anjum had described, they were acquitted on the grounds of self-defense, and they had left town. And it was after they had left that a lot of the incidences of violence happened. People were very upset with the decision, and locally there were documented members of the KKK, and so it started, and the KKK announced that they were coming to town to look into the cover-up because they believed that the case had too many irregularities and that it was questionable that these individuals were not guilty. And so there is where he becomes involved. He the Grand Dragon of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan of Texas, and he had led the rallies to terrorize the Vietnamese. This is a photo of the individuals he was training in Texas, documented as a thing for race war. This event, he shown demonstrated to burn boats because there were boats that had been burned, and you can see the side of the boat they had painted the word USS Vietcong. And so one of the visuals that are portrayed in the after the demonstrations, there were many boat parades, and they would wear the Klan robes, armed with an effigy with hanging from the boat, written on a photo of a American boat with burned. Were also tours being burned where the Vietnamese lived, and many Vietnamese left the towns in this time. Several of them had left for Texas to Louisiana and Mississippi to their livelihood there. So that is where the leadership of the community for legal assistance to deal with the KKK. And so going to play a small clip of the well, and it will show a gathering of the KKK, a fundraiser to to
Uh,
support
uh,
their legal battle.
How, sorry, just sorry to interrupt. I think a few of us are having a hard time hearing what you're saying. It seems like it's cutting out a little bit.
Okay.
I think we can try to test the clip and see if people can hear it. But if not, if you don't mind just describing kind of what it
Tonight, the
shows,
local
that
Ku
would be
Klux
great.
Klan staged.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I can describe it and here. Okay. I'm sorry, it played on its own.
Just off Highway 6.
You know, and then I'll pause it and is that okay?
Uh, Sorry, I didn't quite catch what you were saying. I think perhaps it might be the screen. It's with Zoom, I guess, some technical difficulties. I think perhaps with the screen share right now, it might be lagging a little bit.
Okay.
Sorry, Tao.
No, I'm sorry. I those connections. Okay.
I
Okay.
think
Yeah. I turned off the screen share, so it should just be me. And apologize. Maybe the screen option just wasn't. I apologize. I need to repeat anything later. I'd be happy to. And hope. But you know, I get a great. And so I any questions that you had. I got a lot of Q&A pop up as well during my talking.
okay, great. I think yeah, we can definitely come back to talking about the clip as well if we have a little bit more time. And sorry for the technical issues. I think it just happens sometimes with the screen shares that we didn't realize. So I think having some more context and having now seen some of the individuals who are involved with what was going on with the Vietnamese community, I'd like to transition it over to you, Joe, since you were with SPLC at the time, although you were not the one litigating the case. You have been involved with SPLC for some time as a co-founder. So could you talk a little bit about how SPLC got involved with this particular case and its importance?
Yeah, let me try to do that. Some of it may be a little bit redundant, what you've already heard and will hear. And if my voice starts breaking up, please stop me and let me know, okay? I think it's really important to know the history of the SPLC's work to hold white supremacist organizations and individuals in those organizations accountable. Many of us at the Southern Poverty Law Center had grown up in the 40s, 50s, and 60s in an environment that was consumed with Jim Crow, and in which the KKK and the White Citizens Council provided the rationale and the energy to enforce segregation. The KKK wore the hoods, the capes and the hoods. The White Citizens Council wore the coats and the ties. In November of 1980, the center filed its first lawsuit against the Invisible Empire Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama for instigating an attack on a group of peaceful civil rights protesters in Decatur, Alabama. That's in North Alabama. Marchers were shot and beaten. We sought injunctive relief and damages. The case was not favorably resolved until November the 21st of 1989. So it took a long while, but we got what we asked for, including lots of injunctions and some damages. That resolution date's important, and you'll know why that is in just a minute. Because of all that, because of all that we'd observed for most of our lives, and especially in light of the Decatur case, we established Klan Watch in 1981. Now, due to the expansive nature of hate groups, Klan Watch eventually evolved into our intelligence project. That happened in 1998. Klan Watch's initial purpose, that should be obvious, was to investigate and litigate against Klan groups around the country, which we did in Alabama, Kentucky, North Carolina, Ohio, and of course, Texas. In early 1981, through press accounts, the center became aware of the efforts of a white fishermen's association and the KKK to rid Galveston Bay of immigrant Vietnamese who'd been permitted entry into the U.S. after what I would characterize as the disastrous end to the Vietnamese War. Our lawyers met with the Vietnamese Fishermen's Association and agreed to represent them. On April the 16th of 1981, we brought a class action civil suit in federal court under the 13th and 14th Amendments, traditional civil rights laws that guaranteed all people in the U.S. the right to be free from discrimination. In case the lawyers on the line, it was 42 U.S.C. 1981, 1982, 1983, 1985, and 1986. Those are sections, not years. We eventually removed the 13th and 14th Amendment claims from the complaint, and the court correctly dismissed the 42 U.S.C. 1982 claim because of its application to citizens, not merely people. We also included some unique claims under the Sherman Antitrust Act, RICO, tortious interference with contractual relations, that was a state claim, and another Texas statute that prohibited the establishment and operation of private military groups in Texas. The court issued a preliminary injunction against the defendants in July of 1981, and in August made the injunction permanent. The permanent injunction basically stopped all efforts on the part of the defendants to harass, intimidate, threaten, or do anything whatsoever that replicated in any way the acts that formed the basis of the complaint. Costs and attorney's fees were also awarded to the defendants. And in June of 1982, after intervention by the state of Texas to help us in it, the court agreed with our claim that Louis Beam's KKK had violated Texas law by establishing active militia training for civilians. The court shut down the training camps. As an aside, but an important one, at the outset of the litigation, defendants tried to remove that same federal judge. Her name is Gabrielle Kirk. They tried to remove her because she was Black. She had been appointed by President Carter in 1979 and was the third African-American woman to serve in the federal judiciary. So it's my earlier point. One could easily make the argument that the Vietnamese fishermen's case was the first successful litigation brought under the auspices of the Southern Poverty Law Center's Klan Watch program. There's a great deal of factual and interpretive detail associated with the litigation, and I can't pretend to remember it all. I strongly suggest that you read the court's decisions. They're at 518, Federal Supplement 983, and 543, Federal Supplement 198. And in case you think you need to be a lawyer to do that, you don't. Go online, you can read it there. The Vietnamese fishermen's case was extremely difficult, not just for the complexity of the lawsuit, but more importantly to me, for the courage of the Vietnamese who, under dire circumstances, chose nevertheless to file the lawsuit in the first place and continue it, even as the environment of threats and intimidation grew stronger. There was the infamous February 1981 boat ride or boat parade, in which the KKK and the White Fishermen's Group rowed a boat through Galveston Bay with armed men. You saw this in a photograph earlier. Armed men dressed in KKK robes and hoods, a cannon, and what was clearly the effigy of a Vietnamese fisherman hung by a noose on the rear deck. The ride followed a rally that had been organized by Beam and his military arm, the Texas Emergency Reserve that you heard referenced. But as I said, that was virtually enjoined from operating by the court. There were some very interesting First Amendment issues in that, but we don't have time for it. At that rally, Beam said that if the government did not remove the Vietnamese fishermen from the bay, he and the Klan would, and I quote, take laws into their own hands. He demonstrated how to burn a boat and said the Klan would train white fishermen in their militia camps so that they'll be, and this is a quote as well, they'll be ready for the Vietnamese. This riot and rally were merely the most public of many of the attacks on the Vietnamese community. And by the way, it was all done, these very public things were all done to gain media attention and create fear. The parade, the boat parade, even brought a reporter on board that Klan boat to make sure that it got as much press as possible. At one point during the prosecution of the case, the senior leaders of the Vietnamese community had become so concerned about the threats to their people that they asked us to dismiss the case. After a meeting with SPLC counsel and the local lawyers who were assisting us in the case, they bravely changed their minds and decided to proceed. I can't imagine the courage that it took for them to have begun this process and then, after everything had happened, to continue it. Now, I was not one of the lawyers in the case, as was mentioned. I was practicing law in the District of Columbia at the time, but I was chair of the board of the Senate. So I was kept apprised of the decision to litigate and its progress. Aside from my concern regarding the well-being of the Vietnamese community, I was also greatly worried about the safety of our lawyers and investigators working on the case. The threats they received were right on board, no pun intended, right on board with those delivered to their clients. In concluding, let me say this. As I prepared for this discussion and others that I've had over the last several years, and I've looked back over the last almost 50 years now of the center's existence and thought about where we started and where we are as a country now, I have to ask, where are we? What country is this? I thought the stories of bigotry and hate were relegated to the fringes of society. I was wrong. I see, smell, and feel the 1950s and the 1960s. And perhaps that's a discussion for another day.
Thank you, Joe. That's it's very true, and it's a great transition as well to kind of bring it into, you know, the fact that things that happened in the 80s are still happening today. And I know that, you know, in our previous conversations, Joe, you had mentioned that this case was actually the first time that SPLC had kind of dealt with the hate crimes against the Asian community. And perhaps it was one of the first times that the Asian community felt they can actually stand up against perpetrators of hate crimes and fight for their rights as a contributing member of American society. While this case was triggered by, you know, obviously horrific racial conflict, not many of us were familiar with it, and at least not as familiar as we are with the Vincent Chin case, and there seems to be a reason for that. And Helen, many of us are very aware of your role as a strong advocate and spokesperson for in the murder of Vincent Chin in Detroit, which occurred just 1 year after the Vietnamese fisherman case in 1982. What similarities and differences do you see in the fisherman's case against the KKK and the Vincent Chin case? And how did the Vincent Chin case, you know, kind of lead to a Pan-Asian American movement and much more, you know, well-known across all, kind of really triggered, you know, the sort of a rally against hate crimes in the Asian American community?
Sure. Well, Melissa, thank you for that question. And it's such an honor to be on this panel, and I learned so much already listening to Tao and Joe, because there are a lot of similarities and important differences too. These happened around the same time. I think most of the listeners and most of APABA is familiar with the Vincent Chin case. You know, a 27-year-old Chinese American man who was killed because he looked Japanese at a time of intense racial hatred, especially directed toward Japan, but that basically enveloped everybody who looked Asian, and especially East Asian. And the epicenter there was Detroit, Michigan, because of the collapse of the American auto industry and all of the supplier network. And really, it was a time of great recession for the whole country. And so one of the similarities between what happened in Texas and for the Vietnamese community and what was going on in Detroit was the whole country was really in a pretty long recession then. And in Detroit, it was, in the Midwest, it was a depression. People, you know, really beginning in 1979, there was an economic crisis that began over oil. And so we were already, in the case of Vincent Chin, 3 years into a terrible depression. And I have to say, to Joe's point, there are a lot of similarities of that today. But right now, with this COVID crisis and the, you know, global recession that we're facing, we're just at the beginning. So what happened to the Vietnamese community in Texas and what happened to the Asian community in Detroit, we were already well into it. And so that's something that was very similar, because the excuse that was given that, you know, for the outrage that drew out the racism overtly was, you know, the, you know, people, you Asian invaders taking our jobs, or it's because of Japan, you know, as the killers of Vincent Chin said, it's because of you MFs that we're out of work. And it was a terrible climate of hate. One of the big differences, though, is that in Texas, it was the KKK, an organized white supremacist organization that nobody questioned that their motives were racist, that they had a long history of that to African Americans and to others, and you know, and then they were taking on Vietnamese and lumping onto that the coming after the Vietnam War and throwing all of that in. With the killing of Vincent Chin, it was an individual, well, two individuals, but the one who wielded the bat and beat Vincent Chin's brains out onto the street. They did call up all of the rhetoric of that time, which was war. It was about the war against Japan, the war against Korea, the war in Vietnam, that all lumped Asians together as basically being the same, in other words, the enemy. And at the time, the rhetoric was so strong that people were saying, let's send the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the atomic bombs, you know, one of them on Japan, let's send it back. And so even if you were not Asian and you drove a Japanese-made car, a Japanese model car, you could get shot at on the freeway. So the feeling for Asian Americans in the Midwest at that time is that we all had a big target on our backs. And so when Vincent Chin was killed, one of the things in common of that time, whether it was Texas or Detroit, or really all over the country, except maybe the Bay Area and New York City, was that there really wasn't an infrastructure, you know, an advocacy voice for Asian Americans, or really even for the various ethnicities that were growing at that time. So the Vietnamese community in Texas was small, it was growing. The Asian American community throughout the country, but especially, you know, in, you know, the middle part of America, was also very, very small. And that was true in Detroit. And so we would say, and I was there in Detroit at the time, and we would say that the number of Asian American attorneys, you could count them in the whole state of Michigan on, you know, two hands. And I know for Apaba, it might be hard to relate to that at this point, but the idea of where a community could turn to, you know, for legal help was, you know, really at a time where there was no social media at all. It was all by, who do you know? Can I get a phone number from you? How can we reach out and find somebody who can help us? So Vincent Chin was killed. He was killed in a brutal hate crime. His case was just bungled at every step of the way. The police never did an investigation. There was no talking to any witnesses. And by the time his case wended its way through the courts, the criminal courts, there was no prosecutor present even at the sentencing. So the two white auto workers who killed him, and there was no question about what they had done. It was witnessed by at least 70 people right in front of a very crowded McDonald's on a night that the Detroit Tigers were playing. And so the criminal case, there was no question. These two men had killed him. Race was not a factor at the time, but at the sentencing, the family wasn't even notified. And so the judge took a look at these two very clean cut at that point, you know, wearing suits, white men, and the judge sentenced them to probation and fines and said, these are not the kind of men you send to jail. Now, in a city like Detroit, even in the 1980s, a majority African-American city, there was immediate outrage about the sentencing and a clear, incredibly brutal crime. And to say, these are not the kind of men you send to jail, just people were like, okay, who do you send to jail then? If these men had been Black, people knew that they would have gone to jail. And so then it fell on the Asian American community to say, we could all be Vincent Chin. We could all be killed. And our killers would only get a slap on the wrist. And so it recalled all the things about frontier justice from the 1800s and the idea that you could kill a quote Chinaman in the 1800s and just get off scot-free. So because there was no infrastructure, and I imagine that Texas was like that too, and we did not know about the Southern Poverty Law Center at the time, or we might have called you, Joe. But what we did was we called everybody we could think of, and that meant, you know, a couple organizations in the country, and one of them was the Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco. And even though they didn't have standing or, you know, attorneys in Michigan, they gave us support and advice. And so I think one of the things that was different was we did have a core of Asian Americans in the city that were all unconnected. There was no Pan-Asian movement. And so we began to find each other and to say, look, we've got to stand up. You know, people are outraged about this sentence, but what about the Asian American community? And so what came out of that, to your question about coming together as an Asian American movement, it really was, we realized that strength is in numbers and in unity there is strength. And we were such a small community that all of the different Asian ethnicities, everybody started trying to reach out to each other. And Vincent Chin was Chinese American, so the Chinese organizations, a few organizations and individuals started coming together, and it was a multi-class, multilingual, very different backgrounds. You know, there were waiters and laundry workers, as well as PhD engineers and scientists, and the handful of attorneys who were Asian American. And we began to reach out to every other Asian American group that we could find to just begin to plan petitions, countering, you know, going to court, trying to challenge the judge's sentence, taking it to the Civil Rights Department of the federal government. And to do that, we also knew we were too small. And so we reached out to the African American community, the Jewish, Arab American communities, every religion you can think of, and people really from every walk of life really stood together to say that, nobody should be deprived of their humanity in the way that Vincent Chin was, and that everybody deserves justice. So that led to a civil rights investigation, federal civil rights investigation. And at the time, I have to say, we thought this was the first time that there was an Asian American involved in a federal civil rights case. And clearly, what happened with the Vietnamese fishermen, that was probably the first. But it was all around the same time, around the same, environment that led to these attacks. And in the end, I think, as all of you know, that the killers were acquitted on appeal. And there's really a lot to say about that. Because these were individuals, I think part of the crux was, what is racism toward an Asian American? I think we still have that question today, in this pandemic of anti-Asian hate that goes on. Is it just like, oh, what's the big deal? Does the model minority really experience racism and hate? And so that was a question then. It was a question for the federal civil rights investigators. Is an immigrant protected, like Vincent Chin? We had to establish, actually, that he was a citizen when he was attacked. It was a question whether Asian Americans should be protected by the federal civil rights statutes that they invoked. And these were from the 1800s. One was that he was denied equal access to public accommodation. And the other charge was that there was a conspiracy to deny Vincent Chin his civil rights. And these were all contested. The ACLU of Michigan disagreed with the Asian community. They said this should not be a federal civil rights case. So did the National Lawyers Guild of Michigan. And because of our network that we formed, reaching out especially to California, the attorneys in California stood up and contacted the national ACLU and the National Lawyers Guild. And they sort of slapped back the Michigan, ACLU and NLG to say, no, we support the Asian community in this. So I've gone over time. I should stop now. And I look forward to people's questions. But I think the thing to remember is what happened then to the Vietnamese community and to the Asian American community in Detroit has a lot of resonance today. And I think the same questions, including legal questions that we had to overcome then, are still questions that are coming up again today. So.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. I think we definitely, it's crazy to think that there was no Pan-Asian American movement during that time, because I think we take it for granted now, and, especially with the digital age, something happens across the country and we find out about it, and everybody kind of, comes together. But it seems like, at that time, the whole idea of solidarity and, joining all the different communities of color together, really, it was kind of, coming to light then. And we also don't realize that collaborative relationships that the APA community has had with other communities of color, that it's been going on for many decades, and we're trying to improve upon that now, in the wake of the continued anti-Black racism and violence. And Ginny, at AAJC, what type of work has your organization been doing to combat hate crimes like those discussed in the panel, and what are the biggest challenges that the APA community faces right now?
Thank you so much, Melissa, Anjum, and Apaba DC for highlighting this historical case and bringing it to the present in this current, COVID-19 context. This current climate, much in the way Helen described, the climate around Detroit back in the 80s, I would describe this as the perfect storm. Because we have underlying economic tensions with the country in Asia, sound familiar? Elevated anti-China rhetoric, from elected officials, even before we heard anything about the coronavirus, right? Years of virulently anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies. And all of this had already increased hate incidents targeting communities of color and immigrants generally, which we saw pick up sharply in the run-up and the immediate aftermath of the 2016 elections. And throw in on top of all of this, right, you throw in a global pandemic, which elected officials have repeatedly used racist rhetoric to describe, such as Kung flu and Chinese virus. And that's all against advice of public health officials who urge the use of the correct terms, coronavirus and COVID-19. And all of this has led to Asian Americans experiencing increased harassment, discrimination, and violence during this current pandemic. And so we at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, have taken a multi-pronged approach to tackling this current perfect storm. And so, our anti-hate work, our response framework includes data collection and tracking, in-language resources, hotline with in-language staff, in conjunction with our affiliate in Los Angeles, Advancing Justice LA, legal referrals through the Lawyers Committee, media response and lifting up of API hate incidents, and calling out the administration's hateful rhetoric, as well as legislative advocacy, and a series of bystander intervention trainings. So it's a lot of different pieces to holistically tackle everything that's going on right now. And so just to give you a little bit more background on each of the pieces that we do, in January 2017, back in the day, in the wake of the rise in hate incidents, after the 2016 elections, the Asian Americans Advancing Justice National Affiliation launched the Stand Against Hatred website, which is an online multilingual reporting tool that tracks hate incidents and is accessible in Chinese, Korean, and Vietnamese. We've been documenting both hate crimes and hate incidents, such as harassment or verbal abuse. And it's important that both are reported and not just the crimes that law enforcement responds to. So what we do is we lift up the stories of hate that our communities experience to the media and to policymakers. And for individuals who seek assistance, we offer resources, including access to a legal assistance referral network and a multilingual hotline through our partnership with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law and their Stop Hate Project and our Advancing Justice affiliation. With the COVID-19 pandemic, we've leaned in further, coordinating with other API organizations, both national and regional, for information, resource, and data sharing to increase the collective impact of all the great organizations that are out there. We've created a COVID resources webpage as a one-stop shop for resources, including those of our trusted partners. And we can make those links available for resources after this panel. So Advancing Justice AJC has also taken head on the harmful rhetoric, the anti-Asian rhetoric coming out of this administration and other elected officials through a proactive media strategy, raising awareness for the general public of the harm of racist words and actions. And on Capitol Hill, we've worked to support legislative efforts in Congress to condemn this anti-Asian rhetoric, as well as strengthening response to hate crimes legislatively and improving collection of hate crimes data through legislative efforts. We've also partnered with Hollaback, which is an organization dedicated to ending harassment in all its forms, and we jointly developed a series of virtual trainings to address COVID-19 related anti-Asian harassment. Through this bystander intervention training series, we have trained over 12,000 people since April of this year. We've jointly developed 3 iterations of the trainings, including the broader bystander intervention one, as well as a 2.0 version that's focused on de-escalation techniques for frontline workers who are, not, hunkered down at home, and an impacted community members training for those directly experiencing anti-Asian harassment. In developing this series of trainings, we're able to bring to a broad audience of allies a training that is centered on the history and lived experience of Asian Americans and the anti-Asian racism we face. And so the centering of the Asian American experience to us was very, very important in bringing this training to a broader audience. So we do this work in the current context of the racial justice and the broader public's awakening to the long-standing systemic anti-Blackness and institutionalized racism. And in this context, we do our work tackling the immediate needs of our community while standing in solidarity and supporting the efforts, the advocacy efforts of Black-led organizations and those organizations that have been on the front lines of the criminal justice reform and working on reform policies for decades. And in order to do our anti-hate work effectively and in solidarity with our allies, we also need to look inward. And we need to address anti-Blackness within the Asian American community. So let's be real. We need to get our house in order. We need to have the important and uncomfortable conversations with our families and to also examine our own biases. And so to help with that, we've set up a webpage compilation of resources on anti-Blackness for AAPI communities as a starting point for education, discussion, and how to be effective allies. And that link we can also send around afterwards. So I'll leave it at that and open up to questions.
Thank you, Ginny. And I think that's important, keeping our own house in order. And I think people sort of think, okay, I need to talk to my white friends or, talk to my, white in-laws or whatever. But it's like, well, what about yourself, first of all? And then, your friend, your best friend from childhood who you may not really talk about, certain ththings with, or even your sister or your brother. So that's a really good point. I think before we go into Q&A, we just wanted to kind of loop it back to Tao, in case you had anything to add, any information on the impact of this case on, the community in Seadrift now, the Vietnamese community, the fishermen, the industry. If if there's anything that you wanted to add about that.
First, can you hear me? I'm sorry earlier.
I'm sorry?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? I'll speak a little louder. I apologize about earlier. I saw some of the messages, so hopefully this will work this time. Today the Seadrift community is more focused on the environmental injustices that are going on. Ben Wilson, an activist who's a Seadrift resident 5 generations, has been a environmentalist and has won a lawsuit against Formosa Plastics for the damage in the San Antonio Bay Area Seadrift. But Vietnamese community, there are some families that are still there. The second generation, the children of the fishermen and the crabbermen, are not in the industry. The industry also suffered from the international competition of imports of seafood, also from the natural disasters of hurricanes and oil spills, beef lawsuits. It's had its many shares of tragedies and fights that they've had as a small town. The Vietnamese residents who are there have, kind of forgotten about, maybe not forgotten, but certainly have moved on. And the white community has made amends. There are interracial relationships and families. They have the Vietnamese Lunar New Year celebration in Seadrift, and there's clips of that in the film. And I think in hindsight, people look back and understand all of the socio-political tensions that were part of the cocktail that led to the tensions there. And can we learn from that? How can we reconcile the conflict and to heal and to take those lessons? And as Ginny and Helen and Joe said, what do we know today that we can be informed by the lessons then? So I'm hopeful because people who have viewed the film have kind of got a sense that we have to build bridges, we have to create alliances and coalitions, we have to bridge understandings. And so how do we do that today in a climate of what feels like more divisiveness, and also an embracing of misinformation. And I think that's a critical piece of the Asian American community that we feel, those of us who are you know, in the work of social justice and having to have these conversations with our friends and our family, that there is a lot of information, there is targeting of our communities, there's a manipulation of experiences, our immigration and our migration experiences that become manipulated to have us buy into supremacist ideals, anti-Blackness, and all of the other messy things that we were seeing today.
Thank you. And then we had a question about solidarity between Vietnamese and Black communities. You know, what were other examples? What were examples, I guess, of that? And what's the current status of the Vietnamese? Okay, that already was responded to. How have they aligned to struggle or struggled to align with the Black community with what's going on right now?
Is that for me?
Or it's open.
If I may, that's something that my colleagues who are Vietnamese second generation, we are learning a lot, and at the same time having to teach a lot as well. So it's a very, it's influx. Anti-Blackness in the Vietnamese community is partly an assimilation process. You know, America is built on a racialized hierarchy that has a history of racism, genocide, war. And so if you're an immigrant and a refugee, those are the things that shape and that inform you about see other people, how to see other communities. So that's one issue. The other is that refugees are often then placed into low-income neighborhoods. They're I'm pausing because I had a note that my internet connection was unstable, so I paused. Their job displacement, not access to the economic markets that are most desirable, and so they end up in poor neighborhoods, urban neighborhoods, and so their relationships and interactions with people of color and minority communities are often very transactional within a business setting, nail salon settings, convenience store. And so those tensions exist in those spaces. And so the anti-Black messaging of our society is what the Vietnamese first generation was exposed to. There's a lot of trauma as well in a refugee experience, and so those racial conflicts become amplified as something that those individuals have to deal with. And so how do we, in the work that we do for social justice and bridging those communities, one of the hardest things to do is to convince our elders and those others who share anti-Blackness as a sentiment, how to undo what has been taught, what has been experienced. How do we reframe relationship between Vietnamese Americans and Black Americans? We remind individuals that when the war was over and there was kind of bringing refugees to the United States, there was a lot of resistance, and many Americans, the attitude was that they didn't want these refugees coming to the U.S. And yet the Black community and the Black community leaders had put out in a statement that they support the bringing in of Vietnamese refugees as the humanitarian thing to do, while recognizing that they're in an crisis. And so there's a historical support from the Black community, and we have to kind of dig through our histories to understand that. Also reminding folks that relationships shouldn't be transactional. It shouldn't be that Black community helped us, so we should help the Black community. It's the right thing to do as human individuals. And when we see injustices and we have to call that out. So there's a lot of work done. There's a lot of emotion. I call it an emotional taxing of having those conversations. And at the end of the day, sometimes we have to draw boundaries. And I mentioned earlier the manipulation of information. And there's a real disconnect between the younger generations and the elder generations who are Republican supporters, anti-communists, and are afraid that Democrat liberals will turn this country into a communist one, and anti-Black is in that framework for them. So it's a lot to do in that area.
Thank you. We got a question for Helen Zia. I'm really curious about this question that Helen Zia said came out in the Vincent Chin case regarding whether Asian Americans should be protected from federal civil rights statutes. How has this question been thought about afterwards, and how do you think this question plays out today? How does this relate to the way the civil rights movement has been framed, and how is it still invoked today?
I think
you're on
Helen,
mute.
you're on mute.
Sorry, you'd think we'd learn by this time, but that's a big question, and it's a good question. So the reasoning back then was in even a constitutional law professor from one of the local law schools said that, well, you know, Asian Americans weren't around when these laws were created in the 1800s to protect, mainly to protect African Americans. And so we pretty much had to counter that and say, well, first of all, your knowledge of Asian American history is really poor, because actually there were Asian Americans on this continent for, you know, recorded since the late 1500s. So, but the overall ignorance, I guess, of Asian Americans and our communities and our history and our involvement in this country and continent was missing. And so that was the main argument. And we had to challenge it. I felt that every time any one of us got in front of a camera or had to go to a meeting or had to present to an organization to say, you know, try to get their support, we had to go through Asian Americans 101 every time. You know, yes, many of us are new immigrants or refugees, but some of us have been here for a long time. You cannot assume that we are all the same. We have many different ethnicities. And I'm sorry to say that I think that's still true today. The state of education in this country and elsewhere to be inclusive and to have a history that's, you know, that really reflects the people still doesn't exist. And so, so carrying it forth to today, we still have to address those questions. And so we did education when we went to African American community folks, churches, radio stations, Black radio stations and media. People would ask us, so where did you Asians come from? And aren't you a little, you know, a little late to civil rights? Where were you when we were fighting the civil rights movement? And we're talking in the 80s then. Where were you when we could have used your help? And are you just riding on the coattails of the African American movement? And so these are real questions that people had. And from within, talking about educating ourselves, there were questions within our communities, meetings that we would have with 300 people who would, mostly Asian American, who would stand up and say, if we fight for a civil rights case, does that mean we have to talk about race and racism? And you'd sit there and you'd think, well, yeah, that's what we're talking about. But because people had experienced being so invisible and so much in the shadows and such a marginal community. I mean, we only got the right to become citizens, in the 1950s and to become fully enfranchised. And so, so people didn't know. And we would have to say, yes, we do. And they would reply back and say, well, if we stand up and talk about race, does that mean we will attract more negative attention to us? Speaking of the bravery of the Vietnamese community, will we then become more of a target? And will we be perceived as a problem minority, which in a way was a veiled way referring to the model minority thing, which is, well, so far we're either invisible or we're the good minority. If we talk about race and racism, are we going to be associated with the bad minority? And so all of those things were things we had to talk about. The constitutional law professor who told us that Asian Americans shouldn't be included by, covered by federal civil rights law, he later said, oh, well, I guess I was wrong. I mean, that was his concession to that. And, even under the Reagan administration, they did take up the civil rights case involving, Vincent Chin against his killers. As long as we are silent, and by we, I mean the Asian American community, if we don't speak up for ourselves and say how we connect to the master narrative of America that does not include us, but so it's only we who are going to be able to define ourselves, because if we don't do that, we're going to continue to have to live under these stereotypes of either being the model minority or the eternal alien invader. And so we know that we aren't just, one-dimensional stereotypes, but it falls on us. Nobody's going to do it for us. So we have to speak up about all of these things and wake up and not try to, not be involved in this. We have to be involved in issues of police brutality, defunding the police, anti-Blackness in our communities. We can also talk about anti-Asianness in other communities, including other communities of color. We know that exists. And so we have to speak up about those things, because if we don't make ourselves heard and make ourselves relevant, really relevant to America, we will continue to be overlooked. And not only overlooked, but manipulated, being used to be pitted against other communities of color. The affirmative action debate is coming up again in California as legislation. We know that that's also going to be used directly, taking the Asian American community to be pitted against other communities of color. And so all of these things, how we dealt with it then, I think still is a lesson for us today. We can't stop because we continue to be ignored, treated as irrelevant, whether the debate is about immigration, which most of our community is immigrant, or about racism and violence, which there's a pandemic of racism against our Asian American communities today. If we don't stand up and speak up about it, the way that the brave Vietnamese fishermen did, or Vincent Chin's mother and the community in Detroit did, we will continue to experience these things. We have to be a partner. So we have to be good allies if we want people to ally with us. That was a long answer.
Can I add something to that? It's really interesting. And I'm going to try and remember the quote from Dr. King, where he said, "It's not the words of our enemies that we'll remember, it's the silence of our friends." And I think that's exactly what we're talking about. Communities have to come together. Communities have to speak out, even if they're not the direct object at the moment of the issue. It's still our issue. And we need to do that.
Yeah, thank you, Helen and Joe, for touching on those important issues. We did have one more question, and I know we're almost at time, but I did want to raise the question. And I think Helen, you and Joe both kind of have addressed this, but I'll open it to the panelists. generally. But, you know, we're talking about a historical case. And Joe, you kind of mentioned this, that you see what was happening in the 50s and 60s kind of happening again today. What can we like learn? What can we all, not just the Asian American community, but all the attendees who are coming from a diverse background, lawyers, you know, federal government workers, different walks of life, what can we learn from the 50s and 60s and the important work that you were doing before? And, you know, how can we take active steps in addition to kind of all of the helpful things that Ginny, Tao, and Helen have been talking about, and continuing to raise these conversations in the APA community about anti-Blackness, for example?
Yeah, I think I've talked to a lot of groups around the country over the past 4 years now, and I get asked that question a lot. What can we do? And I think, first of all, if you go to the Southern Poverty Law Center's website, there are answers to a lot of those questions. Go to the Teaching Tolerance website. You'll find a lot of that in connection with kids. But the principal thing is you got to speak out in your community, because most folks aren't going to have more than a community voice. A very small percentage are going to have statewide voices or national voices. But you can do things in your community. And again, you can't keep your mouth shut. When you see something that affects someone else that's spurred on by bigotry and hate, say something about it. Don't be silent. And there are community groups all around the country that get together. There's a large community, something called the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom, which is a group of Jewish and Muslim women. It's a nationwide group, and they have formed to work on exactly these kinds of issues. I'm sure there are groups that I don't know about, but those groups can be formed and they can have an effect.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. And thank you. I think our time is unfortunately up, but I'd like to thank our panelists for speaking on this panel and sharing your knowledge, experience, and expertise with us about this important history of a little known case, as well as for recommending actions we can take to combat hate violence against APAs. That's probably the most important question about what can we do now. I think we all, are here because we want to do something, and it's hard to know what to do, what to tell others people to do. Who do we expect to speak up? Should we speak up? All this stuff. And thank you everybody for joining this panel. We will be sharing resources mentioned on this webinar, and I've taken some notes of other resources as well. And so we'll be circulating that information, and this actual panel that we've recorded will also be available on our YouTube channel that we will circulate as well. And then in order to receive more information regarding upcoming APABA DC events, we encourage those who are not already members to please sign up on our website. And I hope that everybody has a wonderful evening, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.